that this historic agreement signed between the, you know, two countries in the Middle East country and the state of Pakistan, or Pakistan Army, I should say, that there at least there is a parallel to NATO. At least there is someone to stand up to it something wrong. And Turkey, Erdogan took, I think, the lead when Turkey said that will take the Jerusalem militarily. And I think it's got the right. Thousands of years when you talk about this, this was the Ottoman Empire, and there were no such as countries as Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Libya or Syria, and or to that matter, Lebanon. They were all provinces of Ottoman Empire, and I think it should be called the alliance of the willing. And countries like Pakistan, countries like which are many countries in Africa, so 57 Muslim states, there are majority 80 to 90% of them are poor, and they have very small GDP, and they are under immense debt because their gold, their diamonds, they are exploited, their minerals, earth minerals, they're all taken out. And invasion after invasion, and the colonizers are still there from First World War up till now, and the people there are starving. And you can see the vegetables, the fruits, the diamonds, gold, all precious metals, everything is taken from there and is taken to France, taken to Europe, taken to America. And there was monopoly of the Europeans. They got together in European Union and then formed a Nato, and then we have a bully, the greatest terrorist on earth is the United States of America, at the moment presently being run by a mad king, and who you see is talking illogical. In fact, this country should be renamed as Israel Part 2, or the major Israel, and a Sputnik, or a small tiny satellite Israel amongst the heart of the Muslim world, or the land of the prophets, which is called Palestine. And with this little thing, I will just put some things which the word says about it, and I hope to God that the YouTube time this time again don't come up with the same thing, then, because that will be the red line, and I'll put a halt to my making and posting my videos on YouTube forever again.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we look across the Middle East today, we see a region in flux, where old alliances are shifting, new partnerships are emerging, and the balance of power is being tested in unprecedented ways. The recent deepening of military ties between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia is more than a bilateral arrangement. It is a signal that the Middle East is entering a new era of strategic realignment. Saudi Arabia, long seen as the central pillar of Gulf security, is now seeking to expand its sphere of influence beyond its immediate borders. Facing persistent tensions with Iran, ongoing instability in Yemen, and a complex relationship with the United States, Riyadh is recalibrating its strategy. By turning to Pakistan, a nation with one of the largest and most battle-hardened militaries in the world, Saudi Arabia is sending a clear message. The kingdom intends to secure its interests through robust partnerships that extend beyond traditional Western alliances. Pakistan, for its part, is stepping into a role that few outside the region fully appreciate. Historically neutral in many Middle Eastern conflicts, Islamabad's military expertise, strategic know-how, and geographic reach make it a valuable partner for Riyadh. But this partnership is not only about hardware, drills, or training, it is about influence, positioning, and signaling. By deepening its ties with Saudi Arabia, Pakistan asserts itself as a key arbiter of regional security, capable of shaping outcomes that have ripple effects from the Gulf to the Levant. Now, let us consider predictable than ever before. The implications also extend to the broader Islamic world. Sunni majority nations observe the partnership with a mix of admiration and pragmatism. They see Riyadh securing a trusted ally, projecting power, and asserting leadership in a way that resonates with long-standing historical expectations. At the same time, nations outside the Gulf, Pakistan itself, Turkey, and even states in South Asia and Africa, recognize that influence in the Middle East is no longer confined to geographic proximity. It is about strategic partnerships, credibility, and the ability to deliver real security outcomes. Economic dimensions are equally critical. Military cooperation is accompanied by defense contracts, joint research initiatives, and investments that bind these countries together beyond battlefield considerations. The partnership creates economic interdependencies that reinforce strategic alignment. Weapons, infrastructure projects, and training programs are not merely transactional. They are tools of influence, creating networks of loyalty, trust, and long-term engagement. Finance across the Middle East. For decades, nations measured their strategies against U.S. policies and influence. Today, the emergence of regional alliances like the Saudi-Pakistani axis demonstrates that local actors are no longer passive recipients of external policy. They are proactive shapers of the strategic environment. This shift signals a broader trend toward multipolarity, where influence is distributed, resilience is cultivated, and regional players assert autonomy in ways previously unimaginable. Iran is acutely aware of the shifting tides. Tehran's strategy has always relied on a combination of conventional deterrence, proxy networks, and regional influence operations. The strengthening of Saudi-Pakistani military ties challenges every facet of that approach. Iran will likely respond by accelerating missile deployments, expanding regional proxy influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, and deepening partnerships with non-state actors. These maneuvers are not reactive alone. They are designed to signal that any regional realignment against Iranian interests will be met with calibrated, credible resistance. The Levant, a region already beset by political fragmentation and conflict, is now entering a new era of uncertainty. Manage alliances while avoiding provocation against multiple fronts simultaneously. The Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC states, are reevaluating their positions. Nations like Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, traditionally cautious in military alignment, must now weigh the benefits of engaging with a stronger Saudi-Pakistani axis versus preserving neutrality or hedging through diversified relationships with the US, Turkey, and even China. These strategic calculations underscore the fact that regional security is no longer unilateral or US-dominated. Qatar, having navigated a recent blockade and diplomatic crisis, remains a pivotal player. Its independent foreign policy, significant natural gas reserves, and alliances with both Turkey and the US give it a unique position in this evolving regional chessboard. The emergence of a stronger Saudi-Pakistani military collaboration may pressure Doha to reconsider aspects of its defense posture and diplomatic alignments. Saudi Arabia's ability to coordinate defense with Pakistan signals to global investors that the Gulf's oil and gas infrastructure will be more secure. This could stabilize markets in the short term, yet the broader implications of militarized alliances may inject volatility if regional tensions flare. The intersection of energy security and military readiness is now inseparable in the Middle East's geopolitical calculus. Smaller regional actors from Jordan to Oman must also recalibrate. They face the challenge of balancing relations with both the new Saudi-Pakistani axis and Iran-backed actors without becoming entangled in proxy conflicts. Diplomacy rather than confrontation becomes the primary tool for these nations, aiming to preserve sovereignty while navigating a landscape dominated by powerful allies and adversaries. Turkey and Egypt, two historically influential regional players, are watching closely. Turkey's outreach in the Gulf and North Africa, combined with its defense exports, positions Ankara as both a competitor and potential mediator. Egypt, guarding the Suez Canal and maintaining a large standing army, could play a stabilizing or balancing role, depending on how conflicts around Yemen, the Gulf, and the Levant evolve. Meanwhile, Pakistan faces its own strategic calculations. While the Saudi alliance strengthens Islamabad's regional influence and secures economic support, it also risks entanglement in Middle Eastern conflicts. Balancing relationships with Iran, maintaining ties with China and the US, and avoiding overextension in distant theaters are critical for Pakistan's long-term stability. In conclusion, the Pakistan-Saudi military partnership marks a pivotal shift in Middle Eastern geopolitics. It challenges Iran, pressures Israel, stabilizes certain Gulf interests, and reshapes the strategic calculus for smaller states. The Middle East is increasingly multipolar, where alliances are flexible, rivalries intense, and miscalculations can have far-reaching consequences.
Yesterday, September 18th, 2025, the world witnessed the birth of what could fundamentally reshape global power dynamics for decades to come. In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed a mutual defense pact that goes far beyond typical diplomatic ceremonies. At the United Nations in New York, America cast its sixth veto against a Gaza ceasefire resolution, standing alone against the entire international community once again. In Tel Aviv, Yemeni drones pierced Israeli air defenses, demonstrating that regional military superiority is no longer guaranteed. And in Beijing, China condemned Israeli strikes while positioning itself as the champion of international law that America has abandoned. On Wednesday, September 17, 2025, in a gilded palace in Riyadh, something extraordinary happened. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman embraced Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif after signing what can only be described as a game-changing mutual defense pact. Now, before you dismiss this as just another diplomatic handshake, let me spell out exactly what this means. This isn't just any defense agreement. This is a formal treaty that explicitly states that any attack on either Saudi Arabia or Pakistan will be considered an attack on both nations. Both nations. Think about that for a moment. Pakistan, let me remind you, is a nuclear-armed nation. Pakistan has somewhere between 165 to 170 nuclear warheads in its arsenal. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, has the world's largest oil reserves and has been quietly building one of the most sophisticated military arsenals in the Middle East, funded by decades of petrodollar wealth. When these two nations sign a mutual defense pact, when they pledge to treat an attack on one as an attack on both, we're not talking about a ceremonial agreement. We're talking about the foundation of what could very well be the beginning of a Muslim Nato, a defensive alliance that fundamentally reshapes the balance of power, not just in the Middle East, but globally. And the timing is everything. This pact comes in the immediate aftermath of Israel's strike on Hamas leadership in Qatar, an operation that sent shockwaves through the Gulf states and reminded them all of something they'd rather not think about, that their supposed American security umbrella might not be as reliable as they once thought. For decades, Gulf Arab states have relied on American security guarantees, American military bases, American protection. But what happens when America's interests don't align with yours? What happens when America's unconditional support for Israel puts you in the crosshairs? This Saudi-Pakistan defense pact isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening as Gulf Arab states are increasingly questioning whether they can count on Washington when push comes to shove. It's happening as they watch America veto ceasefire after ceasefire in Gaza, while their own populations grow increasingly angry about Palestinian suffering. It's happening as they realize that America's Middle East policy is driven not by regional stability, but by domestic political considerations that prioritize Israel above all else. The agreement goes far beyond just mutual defense. We're talking about defense industry collaboration, technology transfer, military co-production, capacity building, and training. In other words, Saudi Arabia is not just allying itself with Pakistan's military might, it's gaining access to Pakistan's nuclear technology ecosystem. Now, let me be clear, there's no evidence that nuclear weapons are part of this deal. But when a non-nuclear state signs a comprehensive defense pact with a nuclear state, the strategic calculus changes for everyone in the region. And speaking of that strategic calculus, let's talk about what happened yesterday at the United Nations Security Council, because it perfectly illustrates why countries like Saudi Arabia are looking for alternatives to American protection. For the sixth time since this Gaza war began, nearly 2 years ago, The United States vetoed a UN Security Council Pakistan Defense Pact makes perfect sense. This is the environment in which Muslim nations are asking themselves whether they can rely on an America that prioritizes Israeli interests above international law, above human rights, above the lives of Muslim civilians. This is why we might be witnessing not just a bilateral defense agreement, but the foundation of an entirely new security architecture in the Muslim world. The implications are staggering. Pakistan's nuclear capabilities combined with Saudi financial resources and regional influence creates a power center that doesn't exist under American oversight or control. Add to that potential partnerships with other Muslim nations who are equally frustrated with American policy: Turkey, Iran, Malaysia, Indonesia, and you're talking about a bloc representing over 1 billion Muslims with significant military capabilities, economic resources, and geographic reach. This isn't about anti-American sentiment for its own sake. This is about Muslim nations recognizing that America's Middle East policy is fundamentally incompatible with their interests, their values, and their security needs. When America uses its UN Security Council veto power to enable the starvation of Muslim civilians in Gaza, when America provides weapons that kill Muslim children in Palestine, when America diplomatically shields Israel from accountability for violations of international law, Muslim nations start asking themselves a very reasonable question: why should we depend on America for our security? The Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact is their answer. It's a hedge against American unreliability. It's an insurance policy against American abandonment. It's a recognition that in a world where America prioritizes Israeli interests above all else, Muslim nations need alternative security arrangements. The timing of Yemen's drone attack centers emerging to fill the vacuum you've created through your own choices. Consider the practical implications of this Saudi-Pakistani alliance. This partnership creates technology transfer programs that could fundamentally alter the regional balance of power. Pakistan brings to this partnership something that no other Muslim nation possesses: a mature nuclear weapons program with delivery capabilities that span the entire Middle East and beyond. When Saudi Arabia allies itself with Pakistan's nuclear capabilities, the strategic calculus for every country in the region changes overnight. But Pakistan isn't just bringing nuclear capabilities, it's bringing decades of experience fighting asymmetric warfare, counterterrorism expertise, and complete independence from American military doctrine and American weapon systems. Pakistan has been developing indigenous defense capabilities precisely because it learned that dependence on American weapons comes with American strings attached. Saudi Arabia has learned the same lesson through different experiences. Despite spending hundreds of billions on American weapon systems, despite hosting American military bases, despite serving as America's primary Middle Eastern ally after Israel, the Saudis have watched America prioritize Israeli interests over Saudi interests repeatedly. This defense pact is Saudi Arabia's declaration of independence from American security guarantees that have proven unreliable. It's Pakistan's opportunity to expand its strategic influence beyond South Asia. But more than that, it's the foundation for what intelligence agencies are now describing as a Muslim NATO, a defensive alliance that could eventually include Turkey, Iran, Malaysia, Indonesia, and other Muslim majority nations frustrated with American double standards. Resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. 6 times! Let that sink in. While children are starving in Gaza, while humanitarian organizations are confirming that famine has arrived in Gaza, America stood alone against the entire world and said no to peace. 14 out of 15 Security Council members voted for this ceasefire resolution. 14. The entire world, including America's closest allies, supported an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. But America stood alone and vetoed it. Again, because apparently Israel's right to continue its military operations is more important than Palestinian children's right to eat, to live, to exist. The American representative gave the usual talking points about Israel's right to defend itself, about the need for Hamas to release hostages first, about the complexity of the situation. But here's what they didn't say. They didn't explain why America is the only country on earth that thinks the systematic starvation of 2 million people is acceptable collateral damage. They didn't explain why America is the only country that thinks 14 months of bombardment, displacement, and destruction isn't enough. They didn't explain why American weapons continuing to kill Palestinian civilians is more important than international law, human rights, or basic human decency. This is why the Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact matters. This is why we might be witnessing the birth of a Muslim Nato. Because when you watch America use its veto power 6 times to enable what international organizations are calling war crimes, when you watch America isolate itself from the entire international community to protect Israel's ability to continue bombing Gaza, you start to ask yourself a very simple question. If America will sacrifice Palestinian lives for Israeli interests, what makes you think they won't sacrifice your lives for Israeli interests? The Saudis are asking that question. The Pakistanis are asking that question. And increasingly, the answer is driving them to seek security arrangements that don't depend on American goodwill or American interests aligning with theirs.
ईरान और सऊदी अरब का इत्तेहाद हो गया है इसराइल के खिलाफ। सबसे बड़ी खबर आपके साथ शेयर कर रहे हैं जो इस जंग में मुकम्मल तौर पर पासा पलट देगी, जो इसराइल की हार को यकीनी बना देगी, वो खबर आ चुकी है और ईरान और सऊदी अरब इकट्ठे हो गए हैं। इसराइल आज तक इसी वजह से कायम रहा कि ईरान और सऊदी अरब को लड़ा के रखा गया, तफरकात में, फिरकों में, सुन्नी शिया में फंसा के रखा गया, पूरे मिडिल ईस्ट को डिस्टेबलाइज कर दिया गया। लेकिन आज बहुत बड़ी खबर आ चुकी है, आज आलम इस्लाम के फतह की खबर आ चुकी है, आज आलम इस्लाम मुत्तहिद हो गया है और ये सबसे बड़ी फतह है। और आज फलस्तीन के लिए ये सबसे बड़ी फतह है कि इतना बड़ा इत्तेहाद उसके हक में बन चुका है और उसमें रूस और चाइना का किस तरह से किरदार है, ये तफसीलात आपके साथ शेयर करेंगे। और ये इत्तेहाद कितना बड़ा पासा पलट साबित होगा न सिर्फ फलस्तीन की जंग में जबकि पूरे मिडिल ईस्ट में, ये तफसीलात आपको बताएंगे। जबकि गजा में नाज़रीन बहुत बड़ी अपडेट्स आ चुकी हैं, स्नाइपर्स को किस तरह से मारा गया है, हंड्रेड्स ऑफ गाड़ियां, मिलिट्री व्हीकल्स को किस तरह से उड़ाया गया है और हंड्रेड्स ऑफ इनके फौजी किस तरह से हलाक हुए हैं। और इसराइली मीडिया खुद तमाम तफसीलात शेयर कर रहा है और कितनी बुज़दिल आर्मी इसराइली आर्मी साबित हुई है वो तफसीलात भी आ चुके हैं। तमाम सबूत आपके साथ शेयर करेंगे। जिन लोगों ने चैनल को सब्सक्राइब नहीं किया वो चैनल को जरूर सब्सक्राइब कर लें ताकि हर आने वाली वीडियो आप तक पहुंच सके। नाज़रीन आपको यह भी बताएंगे कि नेतन्याहू पर इस वक्त पूरी दुनिया से किस तरह से प्रेशर है, आज पूरी दुनिया किस तरह से फलस्तीन के क़याम के लिए अमली कदम उठा रही है और पूरी दुनिया ने, आलमी ताकतों ने यह फैसला कर लिया है कि फलस्तीन का क़याम अब नागुज़ीर हो चुका है, अब यह हर सूरत में होकर रहेगा। ये अहम तरीन तफसीलात आपके साथ शेयर करेंगे। और इजिप्ट के टैंक किस तरह से बॉर्डर पर पहुंच चुके हैं, मिस्र के साथ जंग का खतरा किस तरह से बढ़ गया है, वो तफसीलात भी आपके साथ शेयर करेंगे। सबसे पहले ईरान और सऊदी अरब के हवाले से अपडेट करते हैं, जो इतना बड़ा इत्तेहाद हुआ है कि तारीख का धारा जो बदल देगा। आलम इस्लाम जो इतने अरसे से जवाल का शिकार था, उसकी सबसे बड़ी वजह यह थी कि हम बंटे हुए थे, हम तफरकात में बट गए थे, हम तकसीम हो गए थे। दुश्मन ने हमें डिवाइड एंड रूल का जो कुलिया है उसमें फंसा के रखा। पूरा मिडिल ईस्ट, दुनिया के सबसे ज्यादा ज़खायर आपको मिडिल ईस्ट में मिलते हैं, दुनिया का सारा तेल मिडिल ईस्ट से जा रहा है, क्या कुछ नहीं है मिडिल ईस्ट के पास, लेकिन उसके बावजूद कितनी तबाही हुई मिडिल ईस्ट में, कितने लोगों की शहादतें हुई, कितने मुसलमान वहां पर शहीद हुए और फलस्तीन का कब्जा आज तक क्यों नहीं छुड़ाया जा सका। उसकी सबसे बड़ी वजह नाज़रीन ये थी कि इसराइल की ये पॉलिसी थी, अमेरिका की ये पॉलिसी थी कि मिडिल ईस्ट को डिवाइड करके रखो, मुसलमानों को तकसीम करके रखो, सुन्नी शिया में फंसा के रखो, तफरकात में फंसा के रखो। और ईरान और सऊदी अरब की जो एक लड़ाई डाली गई उसने पूरी तरह से इस्लाम को नुकसान पहुंचाया, इस्लाम की सरबुलंदी को उसने नुकसान पहुंचाया, फलस्तीन कॉज को सबसे ज्यादा नुकसान पहुंचाया। क्योंकि जो पूरी पॉलिसी है वो सिर्फ यही है, देखें ना इसराइल कितना है, अगर आप मिडिल ईस्ट पूरा देखें तो इसराइल उसमें बिल्कुल छोटा सा आपको नजर आएगा, ठीक है। टोटल उसकी आबादी 80 लाख है जबकि मुसलमानों की आबादी 1.5 अरब है, लेकिन वो इसराइल का कुछ नहीं बिगाड़ सके। तो मकसद क्या था, पॉलिसी क्या थी कि इनको बांट के रखो, तकसीम करके रखो। लेकिन आज जो बड़ा अमल हुआ है नाज़रीन, ये मैं कह रहा हूं तारीख का सबसे बड़ा अमल हुआ है, बहुत बड़ा एक ऐसा धारा बदल देगा ये तारीख का कि जो ईरान और सऊदी अरब की पूरी तरह से सुलह हो चुकी है। इससे पहले एक खबर ये सामने आई थी आज से 3-4 महीने पहले कि बीजिंग ने यानी चाइना ने ईरान और सऊदी अरब की एक सुलह करवाई है और अब मामलात आगे बढ़ेंगे। लेकिन आज बाकायदा तौर पर उसका आगाज इस तरह से हुआ है कि दोनों मुल्क राजी हो गए हैं کہ ایمبیسیز دوبارہ سے کھولی جائیں گی. سعودی عرب ایران میں ایمبیسی کھولے گا اور ایران سعودی عرب میں ایمبیسی کھولے گا. دوبارہ سے تعلقات بحال ہوں گے, دوبارہ سے رابطے بحال ہوں گے. اور ناظرین پچھلے جو 10 سے 15 دن اس جنگ کے گزرے ہیں وہ بہت ہی غیر معمولی تھے. پس پردہ بہت ساری چیزیں چل رہی تھی, بہت زیادہ جدوجہد رشیا اور چائنا کی جانب سے کی گئی تھی. جنیوا میں بہت اہم ترین ملاقات ایران اور سعودی عرب کی ہوئی خفیہ طور پر, اور اس میں یہ چیزیں سامنے آ رہی تھی کہ کس طرح سے ان کا ایک تاریخی اتحاد ہونے جا رہا ہے. اور آج چائنا کی جانب سے یہ مکمل طور پر اس کو عملی جامہ پہنا دیا گیا ہے, جس میں روس کا پورا کردار ہے. بیان دیکھیے, یہ چائنا سعودیہ اور ایران کا یہ مشترکہ سٹیٹمنٹ سامنے آیا ہے کہ سعودیہ اینڈ ایرانی سائڈز ایکسپریسڈ دیئر فل کمٹمنٹ ٹو امپلیمنٹنگ دا بیجنگ ایگریمنٹ. ٹھیک ہے, تو پورا انہوں نے اس چیز کا اعادہ کیا اور پورا اس کمٹمنٹ دکھائی ہے, جس کا مظاہرہ آج سے ہو چکا ہے, جس کا آغاز آج سے ہو چکا ہے کہ جو دونوں ملک ہیں وہ ایک ساتھ ہوں گے. آپ دیکھیں نا کہ اس کی ٹائمنگ کتنی امپورٹنٹ ہے. ایسا وقت جس میں اسرائیل اپنے سروائیول کی جنگ لڑ رہا ہے, اور سعودی عرب پر سب سے زیادہ الزام یہ ہے کہ وہ گرین لائٹ دیے ہوئے ہے اسرائیل کو اور خاموش بیٹھا ہوا ہے. ٹھیک ہے, اور دوسری طرف جو ایران ہے اس پر یہ بات ہے کہ سب سے زیادہ اگر فلسطین کی کوئی مقدمہ لڑ رہا ہے تو وہ ایران لڑ رہا ہے. امریکہ اور اسرائیل سب سے زیادہ اگر نظریں رکھے ہوئے ہیں تو وہ ایران پر رکھے ہوئے ہیں. اگر وہ دشمن کسی کو کہہ رہے ہیں تو وہ ایران کو کہہ رہے ہیں. اگر وہ اسرائیل کو کے لیے سب سے بڑا خطرہ کسی کو کہہ رہے ہیں تو وہ ایران کو کہہ رہے ہیں. ایران یمن, لبنان اور سیریا اور شام, ان سب سے عراق وہاں سے حملے کروا رہا ہے. ٹھیک ہے, تو ایران تو ساری طرح سے کھڑا ہوا ہے, مزاحمتی تحریک کو جو مدد دے رہا ہے, اسلحہ وغیرہ ساری چیزیں وہ ایران دے رہا ہے. تو ان کا نمبر 1 دشمن ایران ہے, اور ان کا جو حمایتی ہے جو خاموش بیٹھا ہوا ہے, جو کوئی کردار ادا نہیں کر رہا, وہ سعودی عرب ہے جو سخت پوزیشن نہیں لے رہا. تو آج یہ اتنا بڑا شفٹ سامنے آیا ہے کہ وہ جو ان کا حمایتی کہا جا رہا تھا آج وہ ان کے دشمن کے ساتھ, یعنی ان کے دشمن یعنی ایران کے ساتھ جا کر کھڑا ہو گیا. اور اس نے اعلان کیا تھا اس ٹائم میں جب پوری طرح سے اسرائیل اپنے وجود کی جنگ لڑ رہا ہے, اور دنیا کے ایکسپرٹ یہ کہہ رہے ہیں کہ جو سعودی عرب ایک گرین لائٹ دی ہوئی ہے اور سعودی عرب خاموش بیٹھا ہوا ہے, اس کا اسرائیل بہت زیادہ فائدہ اٹھا رہا ہے. تو آج سعودی عرب نے وہ تمام داغ جو ہیں وہ دھو دیے ہیں, اور یہ واضح اشارہ کر دیا اور واضح طور پر پیغام دے دیا ہے کہ اب وہ کس سائڈ پر کھڑا ہے. اور اس کے پیچھے ناظرین بہت زیادہ بیک گراؤنڈ میں چیزیں چلتی رہی ہیں. ان تمام فورن منسٹر نے چائنا سے لے کر رشیا اور برٹن اور پتہ نہیں کہاں کا پوری دنیا کا انہوں نے دورہ کیا. اور پھر آپ دیکھیے کہ 20 دن پہلے یہ دورہ شروع ہوتا ہے پوری دنیا کا, اینڈ دین آج سے 3 دن پہلے جو قرارداد پیش کی جاتی ہے یونائٹڈ نیشن میں, تو 95% دنیا جو ہے وہ فلسطین کے ساتھ کھڑی ہوتی ہے. ان ملکوں نے بھی فلسطین کے حق میں ووٹ دیا جنہوں نے لاسٹ قرارداد میں اسرائیل کے حق میں ووٹ دیا تھا یا ایبسٹین کیا تھا, اب انہوں نے فلسطین کے حق میں ووٹ دیا. تو یہ جو پورا ایک دورہ ہوا ہے جس میں رشیا اور چائنا کی سپورٹ شامل تھی, یہ بیک گراؤنڈ میں بہت زیادہ چیزیں چلتی رہی ہیں. اور ہم آپ کو لگاتار یہ کہہ رہے تھے, دنیا بھر کے ایکسپرٹ یہ کہہ رہے تھے کہ سعودی عرب جو ہے وہ اسرائیل کے ساتھ کھڑا نہیں ہو سکے گا. جب یورپ جو اسرائیل کو بچانے والا ہے, جو یہاں پر بسانے والا ہے, وہ ساتھ نہیں کھڑا ہو رہا, تو سعودی عرب کس طرح سے کھڑا ہو سکتا ہے؟ یہ نہیں ہو سکتا. آنے والے دنوں میں آپ دیکھیں گے کہ سعودی عرب کو سخت سٹینڈ لینا پڑے گا, اس کو اس والے بلاک میں آنا پڑے گا, فلسطین کی کھل کر حمایت کرنا پڑے گی, سخت پوزیشن اسرائیل کے خلاف لینا پڑے گی. اور آج وہ پوزیشن لے لی گئی ہے. میں آپ کو کہہ رہا ہوں یہ گیم چینجر ہے, یہ تاریخ کا دھارا بدل دے گا. یہ فلسطین کے لیے سب سے بڑی فتح آج ہوئی ہے کہ عالم اسلام کی 2 سب سے بڑی طاقتیں کون ہیں عالم اسلام میں؟ ایران اور سعودی عرب. یہ عالم اسلام کی 2 سب سے بڑی طاقتیں ہیں, اور آج وہ دونوں اکٹھی ہو گئی ہیں. اور اس ٹائم میں اکٹھی ہو گئی ہیں جب ایک پر یہ الزام لگ رہا تھا کہ وہ سب سے بڑا حمایتی ہے. اگر اسرائیل کو کسی سے خطرہ ہے تو وہ اس ایران سے ہے, ٹھیک ہے, اور دوسرا وہ ہے جس پر بہت زیادہ الزام لگ رہا تھا کہ وہ اسرائیل کا حمایتی ہے. ٹھیک ہے, تو وہ جو اسرائیل کا حمایتی تھا وہ اس بلاک میں آیا ہے, یہ والا اس بلاک میں نہیں گیا. تو ٹائم چیک کریں کہ فلسطین فاتح ہو رہا ہے, ٹھیک ہے, اسرائیل اپنے جو وجود کی بقا کی جنگ لڑ رہا ہے, دنیا اسرائیل کو چھوڑ کر جا رہی ہے, امریکہ جو ہے وہ اس پر عالمی پریشر ہے, اور اس کو ایک کنٹری کی ضرورت ہے. ٹھیک ہے, اور اس صورتحال میں سعودی عرب نے یہ فیصلہ کیا ہے. حالانکہ اس میں ڈیلے بھی کیا جا سکتا تھا, جیسا کہ یو اے کو آپ دیکھیں, انہوں نے بیان دیا کہ ہم جو ہے وہ اسرائیل کے ساتھ تعلقات رکھیں گے. ٹھیک ہے, اسی دوران انہوں نے کچھ انویسٹمنٹ بھی ان کی کچھ کمپنیز کے ساتھ کیے, ان کے نئے دفاتر بھی کھولے ہیں. تو وہ دیکھیں نا کہ ٹائمنگ امپورٹنٹ ہوتی ہے نا, وہ چاہتے تو اس کو ایکسٹینڈ بھی کر سکتے تھے, اگر سعودی عرب چاہتا تو اس کو ایکسٹینڈ بھی کر سکتا تھا. ٹھیک ہے, لیکن یہ ٹائم بہت زیادہ امپورٹنٹ ہے. اس سے آج ساری چیزیں کرسٹل کلیئر ہو گئی ہیں کہ اب فلسطین کے حق میں عالم اسلام کے جو سب سے بڑے جو 2 طاقتیں ہیں وہ ایک ہو گئی ہیں, اور ایک ہو کر وہ فلسطین کا مقدمہ لڑیں گی. تو یہ ناظرین بہت بڑی خبر آپ کے ساتھ شیئر کیا. اب آپ کو غزن یاہو بہت زیادہ ٹربل میں, نتن یاہو اس وقت مشکل ترین دور میں گزرا ہے, اسرائیل سب سے زیادہ مشکل ترین دور میں گزرا ہے. اسرائیل کے جو اقتدار ہے, جو اس کی بدماشی ہے, وہ مکمل طور پر ختم ہو چکی ہے, اور اب فلسطینی ریاست کا قیام अमली तौर पर नजर आ रहा है। पूरी दुनिया से आवाजें उठ रही हैं, सबूत आपके सामने रखने जा रहा हूं ताकि आपको कोई शक ना रहे। ये आप देखिए कि अमेरिका से लेकर यूरोप से लेकर पूरी दुनिया से इस वक्त नेतन्याहू पर प्रेशर है कि वो उनसे फलस्तीनी रियासत के क्याम का मुतालबा कर रहे हैं। मिसाल के तौर पर ये आप देखिए, टाइम्स ऑफ इसराइल लिख रहा है, इसराइली ऑफिशियल्स इन्फॉर्म्ड देयर काउंटर पार्ट्स दे आर अनकंफर्टेबल फॉर टॉकिंग अबाउट टू स्टेट सोल्यूशन। अब इसमें वो वाज़ेह तौर पर कह रहे हैं कि बाकी दुनिया तो बाकी रह गई, यूरोप और बाकी दुनिया से सबसे प्रेशर आ रहा है, लेकिन अब अमेरिका भी ये फैसला कर चुका है कि अब फलस्तीन की रियासत का क़याम होना है। और उसके जवाब में जब वो इतना प्रेशर डाल रहे हैं तो इसराइल उनको आगे से ये कह रहा है कि हम अनकंफर्टेबल, अब उनके लिए कोई वो सख्त अल्फाज तो इस्तेमाल नहीं ना कर सकते। ये तो नहीं कह सकते कि जाओ भाड़ में, हम नहीं मानते तुम्हारे टू स्टेट को, हम नहीं मानते फलस्तीनी रियासत को। उन्होंने एक सॉफ्ट लफ्ज ही इस्तेमाल करना है, तो सबसे सॉफ्ट यही है। लेकिन वो किस तरह से उनकी आपस में जो टेंशन है, जो आपस में इख्तलाफात हैं, उसमें उसको जाहिर कर रहा है कि अमेरिका इस चीज पर राजी हो चुका है और इस पर बात जिद है कि अब फलस्तीनी रियासत का क्या होगा, और इसराइल चाहता नहीं है। अब आप ये पहले समझ लिए कि ये मजबूर क्यों है। मजबूर नाज़रीन इसलिए हुए हैं कि जो बैलेंस ऑफ पावर इस मिडल ईस्ट में बिगड़ चुका है, ठीक है, जो मज़ामती तहरीक पावरफुल हो चुकी है, जो हिजबुल्लाह पावरफुल हो चुकी है, जो सीरिया, आपका इराक, ईरान, यमन, ये सारे पावरफुल हो चुकी हैं, जो खित्ते में ताकत का तवाज़न बिगड़ रहा है, जो फलस्तीन के इत्तेहादी बढ़ रहे हैं। अब अमेरिका और उसके इत्तेहादियों को यह समझ आई है कि भाई अगर हमने इसराइल को बचाना है ना, तो यहां पर अमन करना पड़ेगा। और अमन कैसे होगा? जब अगर फलस्तीन की रियासत कायम कर देंगे तो ही अमन होगा। अगर हम इनको कायम नहीं करते तो ये अमन नहीं हो सकता। और जितनी ताकतवर वो हो गए हैं, अब वो इसराइल को छोड़ने वाले नहीं है। अब ये जंग खत्म होगा में लिए चलते हैं। नाज़रीन, गजा से जो खबरें मैं आपके लिए लेकर आया हूं, आप बहुत ज्यादा उस पर मुतमईन होंगे, और फतह की खबरें आपके लिए लेकर आया हूं, दलाल के साथ, सबूतों के साथ आपके सामने रखूंगा, और ये सबसे बड़ी और अच्छी खबरें आपके लिए होंगी। और सुनकर आपको भी करार आएगा कि वाकईतन भाई जीत जो रहा है वो फलस्तीन जीत रहा है। 75 सालों में फलस्तीन हारता रहा, लेकिन आज फलस्तीन चुन चुनकर बदले ले रहा है। सबसे पहले जो बड़े हमले हुए हैं उनकी इतलात आपके साथ शेयर करते हैं। ये आप देखिए, डिस्ट्रॉइंग ज़ायनिस्ट ट्रूप कैरियर विद अ गोरिल्ला एक्शन डिवाइस, किलिंग एंड वाउंडिंग डजन्स ऑफ इसराइली सोल्जर्स एंड सीजिंग द इक्विपमेंट ऑफ डेड सोल्जर्स इन खान यूनस। ठीक है, उनको मारा एंड देन उसका जो असलहा है वो भी अपने कब्जे में ले लिया। तो ये एक बहुत बड़ा हमला किया गया है गोरिल्ला एक्शन के थ्रू। इसके अलावा जनाब, जो इसराइली स्नाइपर्स हैं उनका भी कब्रिस्तान वहां पर बन रहा है। इसराइली स्नाइपर्स को तीसरे दिन, चौथे दिन उनकी खबर आती है कि उनको हलाक किया गया है, और उनकी वीडियोस भी सामने आती है। अभी जो सबसे बड़ा हमला किया गया है, आर फाइटर्स एलिमिनेटेड एनिमी स्नाइपर्स हु वर बैरिकेटेड देमसेल्व्स इनसाइड अ हाउस। ये 4 से 5
silencing a people by starving them of opportunity. It was about sending a message that the might of the few outweighs the rights of the many. But history, as it so often does, has turned against such arrogance. The sight of ships arriving with aid is a sight of defiance, defiance of injustice, of dehumanization, of the belief that you can forever cage a people and break their spirit. The collapse of the Israeli blockade marks a turning point that few believed would come so soon, and its significance is impossible to overstate. For nearly 2 decades, Gaza has been under a suffocating blockade that systematically restricted the flow of food, medicine, fuel, and other essentials. What was once presented as a matter of security became a mechanism of collective punishment, a daily reminder to Palestinians that their lives were controlled by powers beyond their reach. Yet today, we are seeing the collapse of this system of control, an event that is reverberating far beyond the shores of Gaza. This is not merely the breaking of a blockade, it is the shattering of an illusion that such measures could last forever without consequence. Think about the symbolism of aid ships breaking through the barriers that once stood as insurmountable walls. For years, those ships were blocked, turned back, or even attacked, their mission of delivering humanitarian aid framed as political provocation. Now, as they dock in Gaza, they carry more than supplies. They carry a message to the world that resilience cannot be blockaded. The blockade itself was designed to drain the will of the people, to reduce them to dependence, to render them voiceless. Instead, its collapse has given them the loudest voice possible, one amplified by global attention and solidarity. The image of ships unloading cargo is not just about logistics, it is about history being rewritten in real time. What makes this moment so electrifying is not only the relief it brings to millions of Palestinians, but also the fact that it exposes the limits of power. Israel, with its military strength and international backing, believed the blockade could serve as an enduring instrument of control. Yet every instrument of domination has an expiration date, and history has shown us that walls, embargoes, and occupations eventually face resistance so strong that they collapse under their own contradictions. The blockade's end is not simply a concession, it is the outcome of sustained defiance, both from within Gaza and from those around the world who refuse to accept the normalization of collective suffering. The first images of aid ships entering Gaza's waters carry the weight of decades of struggle, families watching from the shoreline, children waving flags, elders with tears in their eyes. All of this transforms humanitarian aid into a political statement. It says we are still here, we have not been erased, and we are ready to live with dignity once more. This is why the collapse of the blockade is not just about supplies reaching the hungry, it is about affirming the humanity of a people long treated as disposable in geopolitical games. In every sack of flour, every box of medicine, there is a symbolic restoration of rights long denied. But perhaps the most powerful hook of this moment lies in the ripple effect it creates across the region and the world. When people see that blockades can collapse, that injustice can be challenged, it inspires movements elsewhere to push harder, to believe that no structure of oppression is permanent. The arrival of aid ships resonates as much in the capitals of the world as it does in the streets of Gaza. Leaders who justified silence now face harder questions. Activists who campaigned for years now feel the energy of vindication. Ordinary citizens who once felt powerless now see that collective action, persistence, and solidarity can force change even against the strongest opposition. The collapse of the Israeli blockade, then, is far more than a tactical event. It is a historical rupture, one that announces to the world that the balance is shifting. And it leaves us with a simple but profound realization: you cannot blockade hope, you cannot embargo dignity, and you cannot forever silence the demand for freedom. The eruption of celebration in Gaza following the collapse of the blockade is not just a moment of happiness, it is a profound political act, a collective expression of resilience that reverberates across the world. For years, the streets of Gaza have been filled with the sounds of drones, airstrikes, and despair. Families lived under constant stress, parents unsure how to feed their children, hospitals forced to function without the medicines and supplies necessary to save lives. And yet, as the aid ships finally docked, those same streets transformed into arenas of joy, filled with music, dancing, flags, and the unmistakable sound of a people declaring that they are alive, unbroken, and ready to claim their humanity once more. That joy, so long suppressed, burst forth like water breaking through a dam, unstoppable and contagious. The images of men, women, and children pouring into the streets to welcome the ships are unforgettable. Children waved flags as if they were holding the future in their hands, while parents smiled with the relief of knowing that, for the first time in years, food and medicine were not just distant dreams but tangible realities arriving at their shores. Elders, many of whom have endured decades of conflict, stood with tears in their eyes, their expressions capturing both the pain of the past and the hope for tomorrow. These celebrations are not just spontaneous gatherings, they are living testimony that the blockade, meant to crush the spirit of Gaza, has failed in its most fundamental goal. Instead of breaking the people, it sharpened their determination to survive, and now their celebrations become a form of defiance more powerful than words. In politics, we often underestimate the significance of joy, yet here joy becomes a weapon. The sheer act of Palestinians celebrating publicly sends a message louder than any protest: you have not erased us. It demonstrates to the world that the spirit of Gaza remains indomitable, that even after years of bombardment and isolation, they can still fill their streets with life and song. This joy is not shallow or fleeting, it is rooted in suffering and in the knowledge that every smile is an act of resistance. It challenges the narrative that despair has the final word. Instead, celebration itself becomes a declaration of victory, however small, in the long struggle for dignity. The power of these celebrations also lies in the images they project beyond Gaza. Across the Middle East and in capitals around the world, people are watching. They see Palestinians not only as victims of endless conflict, but as human beings capable of joy, resilience, and collective pride. That shift in perception matters deeply. It builds solidarity, reminding the global public that Palestinians are not faceless casualties, but vibrant communities yearning for the same basic freedoms everyone else enjoys. When the world sees them celebrate, it humanizes their struggle in a way no statistic or policy debate could achieve. And yet, what hooks us most deeply is the knowledge that these celebrations carry both relief and urgency. Yes, aid has arrived, but people know the blockade's collapse is fragile, its permanence uncertain. That is why they celebrate so fiercely now, as if to seize this rare moment of triumph and hold it against the uncertainty of tomorrow. Every chant, every flag waved, every drumbeat becomes a statement that their spirit cannot be caged, even if the blockade returns in another form. In that sense, the celebrations of Gaza are more than a reaction to aid ships. They are a prophecy. They foreshadow a future where Palestinians will not just rejoice at temporary relief, but at true freedom, a freedom that cannot be delayed or denied forever. And in their joy, we find the clearest reminder that even in the darkest conditions, the human desire for dignity and life burns brighter than any blockade ever could. The arrival of aid ships to Gaza is more than a logistical triumph. It is a living symbol of international solidarity, the kind of solidarity that governments often hesitate to embrace, but that ordinary people and grassroots movements insist on building. For years, efforts to break the blockade were met with resistance, condemnation, and even violence. Ships attempting to bring medicine or food were stopped, activists were imprisoned or killed, and the international community was told that such missions were reckless or illegitimate. Yet persistence has prevailed. The sight of aid ships reaching Gaza's shores demonstrates that even in a divided world, there are forces strong enough to pierce the walls of isolation. That solidarity now stands as a beacon not only for Palestinians, but for oppressed peoples everywhere. This moment is not simply about supplies being delivered, it is about the power of collective conscience. Civil society groups, human rights activists, and ordinary citizens from across the globe have long demanded that the siege end, and many of them risked their lives to challenge it. Their voices, amplified over years of protests, petitions, and campaigns, formed a relentless pressure that governments could no longer ignore. When these ships docked, they carried not just aid, but also the weight of countless acts of resistance around the world, acts that converged into a powerful, undeniable message. Injustice cannot be normalized forever. That convergence of global will is what makes the arrival of these ships so politically profound. International solidarity has always been a double-edged sword for those who enforce blockades. On one hand, they attempt to isolate a population, hoping to suffocate its will. On the other hand, that very act of isolation draws attention, mobilizing networks of empathy and activism that transcend borders. Gaza became a symbol, and symbols travel faster than bullets. The image of children starving behind blockades could not be contained, and slowly, steadily, the blockade's moral foundation eroded under the weight of international outrage. The arrival of these ships is the physical embodiment of that erosion. It shows that the wall of silence has cracked and that the determination of millions across the globe has materialized into concrete action. What makes this solidarity particularly powerful is that it comes at a time when global politics is fragmented, nations are divided, alliances shift constantly, and self-interest often trumps moral responsibility. Yet even in this fractured world, the plight of Gaza managed to cut through the noise, uniting diverse voices, from activists in Western capitals to communities across the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. The aid ships are a reminder that people, even when divided by borders, languages, or faiths, can still rally around the most basic principles of humanity: that no child should starve, no hospital should lack medicine, no people should live in cages. That universality is the hook that draws us in. It forces us to see that solidarity, when nurtured, is one of the most unstoppable forces in politics. The arrival of the aid ships also plants seeds of accountability. It tells governments everywhere that silence has consequences, that public opinion cannot be endlessly ignored. Leaders who justified or tolerated the blockade now face growing scrutiny from their own citizens, who have seen with their own eyes the possibility of breaking injustice through collective action. The symbolism is undeniable. If activists, ordinary people, and a coalition of global voices can break a blockade, then excuses for inaction lose their power. The aid ships, in this sense, are not just lifelines for Gaza, but warnings to policymakers worldwide that solidarity has teeth, and when it grows strong enough, it can tear down walls once thought permanent. So, as we watch Palestinians rejoice, we must also recognize that their joy is intertwined with a global movement that refused to give up. Every cheer in Gaza's streets echoes in the hearts of those who fought for years to make this moment possible. And every ship that lands is a reminder that solidarity is not abstract, it is real, tangible, and capable of reshaping political realities. The blockade may have been built with weapons and walls, but it was solidarity that cracked it open, and it is solidarity that will keep pushing until justice is no longer a dream deferred, but a reality delivered. The collapse of the blockade and the arrival of aid ships represent far more than a humanitarian success. They mark a profound political and moral turning point that forces the world to confront uncomfortable truths. For years, the blockade was justified under the language of security, cloaked in the rhetoric of necessity, and defended by some of the most powerful states and institutions in the world. Yet the reality beneath the rhetoric was always clear. An entire population was subjected to collective punishment, denied access to basic human needs, and stripped of dignity. When those ships sailed into Gaza, they did more than deliver supplies. They shattered the illusion that the blockade was unshakable, and they exposed the fragility of the arguments that sustained it. This moment does not simply alleviate suffering, it disrupts the narrative that suffering was inevitable. Political turning points are often recognized only in hindsight, but there are moments when their weight is felt instantly. This is one of those moments. The arrival of aid ships is not just an isolated victory, it is a signal that the balance of global opinion is shifting. Even governments that once stood silent or complicit will now find it harder to defend policies that starve and isolate millions. The moral ground has shifted, and the blockade, once tolerated as a tragic necessity, now looks increasingly indefensible in the face of joyous images of children receiving food and medicine. That contrast between the cruelty of restriction and the relief of freedom hits harder than any political speech ever could. It forces people to ask if aid can arrive today. Why was it denied for so long? The moral turning point is equally powerful. For too long, Palestinians were spoken about in the language of statistics, numbers of dead, percentages of poverty, rates of malnutrition. The blockade reduced them to figures on a report, stripped of humanity. But the celebrations that followed the arrival of aid ships cut through that reduction. They reminded the world that behind those statistics are living, breathing human beings capable of joy, resilience, and community. The blockade was not just a political policy, it was a moral failure, a decision to normalize human suffering. Its collapse reminds us that such normalization is fragile, that once people are seen in their full humanity, denial of their rights cannot be morally sustained. The hook here is not only that aid ships arrived, but that they forced a reckoning. They showed what happens when injustice is challenged and when moral clarity emerges from years of moral compromise. They create a contrast that the global public cannot unsee. A people once isolated, now receiving solidarity, a blockade once defended, now visibly broken, a narrative of inevitability, now replaced with the possibility of change. These moments build momentum. They inspire questions that do not vanish easily. What other injustices are defended in the same way? How many blockades, literal and metaphorical, exist in the world sustained only by apathy and silence? The political ramifications will ripple outward. Leaders who align themselves with the blockade will face growing criticism, while movements that opposed it will feel emboldened. This is the dynamic of turning points. They shift the terms of debate, redefine what is considered acceptable, and open space for alternatives that once seemed impossible. The collapse of the blockade may not end the broader conflict, but it has redrawn the moral map, and once redrawn, it cannot easily be erased. This is why the arrival of those ships is more than aid. It is a spotlight exposing the bankruptcy of old arguments and the possibilities of new futures. It is a reminder that moral clarity can emerge suddenly, cutting through years of obfuscation. And in that clarity lies the seed of transformation, not just for Gaza, but for a world that has too often chosen convenience over conscience. When the blockade finally collapsed and aid ships arrived, the celebrations that erupted across Gaza carried a meaning that goes far beyond the simple relief of receiving food or medicine. In those joyous scenes, we witnessed something deeper, a powerful act of resistance expressed through joy. For years, Palestinians were portrayed through the lens of suffering, images of bombed out buildings, long lines for bread, hospitals struggling to cope. Yet in that moment, they reclaimed the narrative, showing the world not just their pain but their vitality. Their joy was not naivete, nor was it shallow. It was an act of defiance, a way of declaring that after everything, their spirit remained unbroken. The most powerful regimes can deny freedom of movement, they can restrict access to water, they can silence voices through force, but what they cannot take away is the human ability to celebrate life in the face of oppression. The streets of Gaza became alive with the sound of drums, chants, and dancing. Children, who had grown up knowing only checkpoints and shortages, suddenly found themselves part of a celebration that was larger than life. Parents watched their sons and daughters smiling, waving flags, and running through the streets with the sense that something had shifted. Elderly men and women, who had lived through decades of war and despair, stood with tears streaming down their faces, witnessing a moment they thought might never come. This eruption of joy itself became a political statement louder than any speech or press release. It announced to the world, you tried to silence us, you tried to crush us, but here we are, still singing, still dancing, still alive. What makes this joy so profoundly resistant is that it emerges from the very conditions meant to extinguish it. The blockade's purpose was not only to restrict goods, but to suffocate hope. It was meant to create despair so deep that joy would seem impossible. And yet, the arrival of aid ships unleashed a tidal wave of celebration that mocked the very premise of the blockade. Every cheer was a reminder that joy cannot be embargoed. Every drumbeat carried the rhythm of survival. Every dance in the streets mocked the assumption that deprivation could erase culture, community, or pride. That is the hook that pulls us in, seeing joy not as escapism, but as a form of resistance more resilient than any wall or weapon. The world is watching these celebrations, and what they see reshapes perception. For too long, Palestinians were framed only as victims, their humanity overshadowed by endless tragedy. Now, the images of celebration restore their agency. They show that Palestinians are not merely passive recipients of aid, but active participants in their own story, finding ways to turn even small victories into moments of collective empowerment. This shift in perception matters because it counters narratives that reduce them to statistics and instead presents them as a people who insist on joy despite everything. But there is also a deeper urgency in these celebrations. The people of Gaza know that aid shipments do not erase decades of occupation or guarantee a future free from suffering. Their joy is both a release and a warning. If we can celebrate like this for one small victory, imagine how we will celebrate when real freedom comes. That anticipation, that readiness to transform temporary relief into permanent liberation, is what gives these celebrations their revolutionary power. In the end, joy becomes more than an emotion, it becomes a declaration of existence, it becomes a refusal to be defined by suffering alone, and it becomes a reminder to the world that no blockade, no matter how powerful, can ever extinguish the human capacity to find hope, to dance, and to dream of freedom. The arrival of aid ships and the collapse of the blockade mark an extraordinary moment, but celebrations alone cannot disguise the deeper reality that this breakthrough, while historic, is only temporary relief unless the root causes of the blockade are confronted. Food, medicine, and fuel will ease immediate suffering, but they cannot erase the structures of occupation, inequality, and double standards in international politics that created the crisis in the first place. That is the sobering truth. Without lasting change, This moment risks becoming a fleeting victory rather than a turning point. What hooks us here is the urgency of the question: will the world treat this as the beginning of transformation, or as an isolated episode quickly forgotten once headlines fade? The blockade itself was never just about borders or trade. It was about control. It was designed to suffocate a people, to make daily survival a struggle so overwhelming that the demand for freedom would be muted by the urgency of finding bread or clean water. The aid ships that broke through gave Palestinians a moment to breathe, but breathing is not the same as living. Lasting change means dismantling the machinery of domination that enforces the conditions of blockade, ensuring that no child grows up dependent on unpredictable convoys of humanitarian supplies. It means moving from relief to rights, from charity to justice. That shift is the real measure of progress, and it is far harder to achieve than sending ships across the sea. The international community now faces a test. For years, it tolerated the blockade, hiding behind claims of security and sovereignty. Now, with the blockade visibly cracked, silence is no longer a neutral position, it is complicity. People across the globe are asking why this collective punishment was allowed to continue for so long, and why it takes extraordinary acts of defiance to deliver what should have been guaranteed rights. If leaders fail to answer those questions, the credibility of international law, human rights rhetoric, and even democratic ideals will continue to erode. This is not only about Gaza, it is about whether the global system itself can hold up under the weight of its contradictions. Lasting change will also require addressing the double standards that have haunted this conflict for decades. Too often, the suffering of Palestinians has been minimized, while the actions of powerful states are shielded from meaningful accountability. That double standard has not only prolonged the conflict, but also emboldened those who enforce blockades and occupations elsewhere in the world. The collapse of the blockade is therefore more than a regional development. It is a mirror held up to global politics. It forces us to ask why some people's rights are treated as negotiable while others are defended as absolute. Breaking that cycle of selective morality is the only way to ensure that what happened today is not reversed tomorrow. The people of Gaza understand this better than anyone. Their celebrations are full of joy, but also filled with the wisdom of experience. They know aid ships do not end decades of occupation, nor do they dismantle systems of inequality. Yet their determination, their refusal to let the blockade define their future, points to what is possible if the momentum of this moment is carried forward. That is the hook the world cannot ignore. If a besieged people can keep demanding justice through years of unimaginable hardship, what excuse do the rest of us have for settling for temporary fixes instead of structural change? The collapse of the blockade may have begun with ships arriving on Gaza's shores, but whether it becomes a true turning point depends on what comes next. If the world finally confronts the roots of this crisis, then this moment will be remembered as the spark of transformation. If it does not, the celebrations will fade and the suffering will return. The choice is stark, and it lies not only with politicians and governments, but with all of us who believe that justice cannot be delayed forever. So tonight, as Palestinians celebrate and aid ships dock at their shores, let us not see this as their victory alone. It is a victory for humanity, for justice, for the belief that suffering is not destiny. And let us carry that belief forward, louder, stronger, more determined than ever. Because the day those ships arrived, they brought more than supplies, they brought a glimpse of the future. A future where the blockade is not only collapsed, but unthinkable. A future where no people live in chains and no
यूनिवर्सल टेलीविजन को सब्सक्राइब करना ना भूलें। उसके बाद बेल बटन पे क्लिक करें और अपने कमेंट्स के सेक्शन में अपने कीमती जो ख्यालात का इजहार जरूर